to episode 4 of Ping, the Firewalls.com podcast. A bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including top products, the latest trends, news, expert tips, and interviews with top security industry company representatives. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hey.
Hey, Andrew. As we dive into a different featured topic each episode. New episodes of the podcasts come out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest one. And feel free to leave a comment or email us at podcast@firewalls.com with feedback or questions. Now on to our featured topic and our guest for this episode.
Network security companies don't just make hardware and software and call it a day. They stay up to the latest threats to ensure their products and service continually stay up to the task of protecting their users' networks. With the ever-evolving threat landscape, that can be a challenge. We thought it'd be an interesting, deeper look to learn how they go about it and how you can see what they're seeing.
So on this episode, we welcome Marc Laliberte, an information security threat analyst with WatchGuard Technologies. Marc specializes in network security protocols and Internet of Things technologies, along with keeping up on the latest security threats and trends, among many other things, which we'll get to throughout our conversation. Marc, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me on.
Appreciate it. And so that was kind of a high-level summary of what you do. But to get a little deeper, take us yourself through what may be a typical workday, if there is such a thing.
There is definitely not such a thing with me. I am a man of many hats here at WatchGuard. Actually, my job's actually kind of split into a few different roles. One of them is I lead our threat research team. We call the WatchGuard Threat Lab. Where we try and take threat intelligence that we get from all across the world, analyze it, and then put it out in a useful form for our customers and other people in the industry. Within that, we expand beyond just what WatchGuard does as a company, when we have our own individual research projects and specialties as well. So when I'm in the office, I'm usually trying to tackle the pile of IoT devices, as you mentioned, is my favorite. Where I'll just go onto Amazon.com, buy a whole bunch, stick them on my desk, and when I get bored, try and find holes in them and try and report those vulnerabilities to the manufacturers and get them fixed just to try and make that area a little bit safer for end users. Outside that, though, I'm also one of our evangelists, where I get sent around to represent WatchGuard for the company and for our partners at different trade shows and different events, and really just to go talk about security topics and try and bring awareness to different areas, and then educate end users and partners and other folks in the industry on different cybersecurity topics, really ranging from just about everything, actually.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of those latest threats. We often talk about threat intelligence on our website and make a lot of allusions to it, but how does WatchGuard Threat Labs actually go about conducting this research?
Yeah, so we're actually in a really good position to get some firsthand knowledge on the threats that our customer base, which is small, medium businesses and what we call distributed enterprises, what they're seeing out there every single day. So our main product is something called the Firebox, which is really a UTM or NGFW or whatever acronym you want to use. And it's got a checkbox in there to report home threat intelligence to us anytime it detects a network event that is a malicious event. And so we get these feeds in what we call the Firebox feed, for lack of better creativity, where we can see all the malware that our customers' perimeters are blocking, all the network attacks that they're seeing from our intrusion prevention service. We have a new DNS watch, is what we call it, a DNS firewall service, so we can see threats blocked over DNS as well. And really it just gets aggregated into this giant database, and we have the world's ugliest Python scripts that we use to go through it and pull out interesting intelligence. So slices of just stuff from the most basic. What's the most prolific malware that's out there? What's the malware that's affecting the most individual unique networks? What are some of the top phishing domains that the bad guys are using this week? Really interesting stuff, actually.
And that kind of leads into the next point, which is, why is knowing all of this stuff so important?
When it comes to defending against the bad guys, you really have to know what they're doing. You can't defend against an unknown threat, really. And so by knowing the threat landscape and what kinds of tools and techniques the cyber criminals are using out there, you as a customer have a better chance of setting up the right technical defenses and the right training for your end users to protect against them. And then us as a network security company know where to focus our attention when it comes to developing and improving tools or adding other defenses into the products that we sell too.
So we put a lot of time and effort into gathering all this information. How is that actually put in practice and filtered down to the end user level?
Yeah, so from our team, we've got a few different ways of getting this information out there. We put out an internet security report every single quarter. Our report for quarter 2 actually just came out a few days ago, I think earlier last week.
Do you say it came out or dropped, or what do you like to use parlance-wise?
I tried to switch it up. This last quarter, it came out.
Okay.
Maybe next quarter we'll drop it. We'll see.
All right.
If you're interested, it's on WatchGuard.com/security-report, I believe. So we put out these quarterly reports where we look at the network security trends on a obviously quarter by quarter basis, so a bit of a wider view. We also have our threat research blog, secplicity.com. Oh man, how do I spell it? secplicity.org rather. And from there, we take like the day-to-day intelligence we see, or really just break down news stories also from whatever the latest threats are from other researchers, and try and make them simplify them so that really even non-security professionals can understand them. And also on that same site, we've got our threat research or our threat intelligence portal, secplicity.org/threat landscape, I believe, where you've got all the data that we use in our quarterly reports available really in a live form where you can slice it down to individual countries, date ranges, whatever you really want to look at to see what's pertinent to your organization.
And we'll make sure to get those links in the description as well for everybody listening. So talking a little bit more about the threat landscape, we've talked about some of the ways that people can consume the information and some of the ways that it's put into practice on your end. But in particular, are there any that are popping out at you right now that are particularly threatening this time of year here in 2019? What are some of the top threats that you are seeing?
Yeah, and honestly, I could probably talk for 2 hours on this. So I'll try and keep it short. Some of the big things that we're seeing most recently are, I guess I can bucket them into a few different categories. And the first one is attacks against authentication and passwords. So there's a really popular tool out there called Mimikatz. It's been around for quite some time. It was originally developed as a tool for researchers for, as most attacking tools are for researchers, to take passwords or password hashes out of memory on Windows systems. And we've been watching this tool just skyrocket in our malware detections over the last year and a half or so. And that is still currently our number one threat in terms of volume out there. And it highlights a trend that we're seeing where the bad guys have recognized that authentication is the cornerstone of security. We design all of our systems to keep the bad guys out, keep the good guys in, and we differentiate them through a username and password. So if they can get a hold of that password, they just might have the keys to the kingdom if you're not using defenses like multi-factor authentication. And so we've seen a lot of attacks that go after usernames and passwords. Mimikatz is an obvious one. There's been a lot of phishing attacks we've seen that'll send users to a fake Office 365 login portal or Google Docs portal and try and steal their credentials that way. And then once the attackers have that, they can use that to compromise your main account, go after other accounts because password reuse is such a big issue across our industry. That's the main number one. And then another one we're really seeing are a lot of what we call fileless malware attacks. And this one's a bit technical. I'll try to keep it short and simple, but traditional malware always leaves a file on your hard drive, and that's how it gains persistence. That's where the malicious code is. So if you get rid of that file, you really get rid of the malware. Attackers are starting to pivot towards using fileless malware. where the malicious code is actually injected into memory, either from like a PowerShell script nested within an Office document, or just exploiting a known code execution vulnerability in some otherwise benign application. And it allows them to kind of sit and hide without traditional anti-malware tools being able to detect them. And we've seen those threats really start to pick off in the last 3 months to a year or so. And we expect that trend to continue.
Piggybacking off of both of those, you mentioned, first off, we'll go back to the authentication side, that multi-factor authentication is one way to combat that type of hack from occurring for somebody. But what are some other tricks that people should think about with securing passwords, usernames, etc.?
Yeah, so we as humans are pretty bad at choosing strong, unique passwords, especially when we need tons of them. Like, I have hundreds of accounts through websites and my work and all that. And if I had to pick a strong, unique password for each of them, it would just be impossible. I wouldn't be able to remember all of them. So I'm actually a really strong advocate for password managers, tools like LastPass, OnePass, KeyPass. There's tons of them that do a really good job of safely and securely storing your passwords and generating strong, unique ones for each individual account, so you don't have to remember them. I don't know the password for just about all of my accounts. Like, if I had to guess my Gmail password, I would not be able to. And instead, I just have a very strong master password. Mine's something like 30 to 40 characters. I haven't actually counted it out. That's the only thing I have to remember. And because of the strong encryption that my password manager uses, even if a bad guy is able to like hack the company and steal their databases, they don't know my key. It's all downloaded locally and decrypted locally. So there's no way they're going to get a hold of all of my passwords. So it's actually pretty secure. That's one good way to combat that threat. But really, multi-factor authentication is one of the best tools that you can deploy to combat password theft and poor password practices. Because even if the bad guy gets a hold of your really strong, unique password, or even if they cracked your cruddy one that you had maybe shared between a few different accounts, they can't get into your account without breaking into your home and stealing your mobile phone and maybe even cutting off your thumb to get into the biometric portion of it. So it really keeps you a lot safer from those types of attacks.
So are there any particular threats out there that you're seeing that should be a special concern for small to mid-sized businesses? That's sort of our demographic of focus most of the time.
Yeah, so the one thing I want to point out is that a lot of these attackers, they don't really care how big or small your business is. There's no such thing as being too small to be targeted by an attack. Obviously, there's different categories of attacks that predominantly go after larger versus smaller organizations, but just because you only have like a half dozen to maybe less than 100 employees doesn't mean you're off the radar from the cyber criminals. So when it comes to keeping your network safe, you really got to make sure you have the right tools in place in order to stop a wide range of attacks. Now, when it comes to the specific ones that I think are targeting SMBs specifically, one of the big ones that's still out there, annoyingly, is ransomware, and really the evolutions of ransomware. So it kind of plateaued in the last few years, where it was like 2015 down to 2013 was really when the ransomware epidemic took off. And it kind of petered off in the last few years or so, but it's coming back with a vengeance. And they've evolved to the point where now a lot of these ransomware attacks fall under this category that we call ransom worms, where they have worm-like self-replication and they can propagate and infect a system without any user interaction whatsoever. You don't have to trick someone to open up an email, click a malicious link, or install an application. Instead, they just go after an exposed port with a known vulnerability, hit that system, and then pivot and hit everything behind your network perimeter as well, just automatically. And those are frightening attacks because a lot of SMBs are still ill-prepared when it comes to a ransomware attack. A lot of them don't have tested backup and restoration systems in place. A lot of them don't have a disaster recovery plan at all, so that if they get hit with ransomware and all of their important files suddenly get locked up, they're in for some real big trouble there.
And so, just as an example, WannaCry was a ransom worm, correct?
Exactly. That was actually one of, if not the first ransom worms that we saw out there. It took the Eternal Blue vulnerabilities, as they were called, so zero-day vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows' file sharing protocol, and tacked it on to a pretty generic ransomware payload. But just by adding those automatic exploits of those only recently patched vulnerabilities, it was a massively damaging attack. It caused billions of dollars in damages and hit a lot of really big name companies too, like FedEx and Maersk, the shipping company. You probably heard the NHS in the UK was basically shut down for a few days. It was a hugely damaging attack just by adding one small little self-replication script to it.
And so one thing that we see is a lot of times, you just mentioned, you get a lot of these organizations, businesses, governments, local and beyond, get hit with ransomware and they haven't backed up. So they are paying the ransom a reasonable amount of time now.
Yeah, and that's something that it's easy for me to sit here and say, don't pay the ransom. And I get that sometimes you are really in a spot where it seems like paying the ransom is the only option to get your data back. But it doesn't always guarantee that you're going to get your files back. There's a lot of attacks out there that kind of masquerade as a ransomware attack, but really they're just lockers. They're designed to encrypt your files, and there's no mechanism in place to decrypt them if you end up paying the bad guy. And so really paying the ransom only guarantees that the cyber criminals have more funding and now more incentive to carry out further attacks, especially against you since they know you pay. So instead, you really need to take a proactive approach and make sure that you are never put in a position where paying the ransom is your only option. And that boils down to the right training and technical tools in place to try and defend against the attacks, and then a plan put in place in case the worst case scenario happens and you do get infected. And that means having a tested backup and restoration system in place. And that backups aren't good enough. You do need to make sure you test them. The number of times I've gone to like these different cybersecurity events or really just trade shows for our partners out there and chatted with their customers, and they said that, oh yeah, we had this backup system. It was working great, had offline backups, cloud backups, all that. But then when it actually came down to it, it turns out it broke 6 months ago and we ended up losing 6 months worth of data. It's rough, and that's not a good spot to be in. So make sure you're testing that on a regular basis too.
So moving on to another area of vulnerability, and something that you mentioned at the outset, kind of testing through all the IoT devices out there. And we look at cyber headlines a lot on this podcast. I know you do on your podcast as well, but one of the headlines that you see often is device X, such as maybe a webcam, maybe it's a speaker, a thermostat, etc., is very vulnerable to malware and malicious behavior from bad actors. So what's out there and what can people do about it in terms of IoT devices?
Yeah, man, it's rough. And really when it comes to IoT, it reminds me of like the late 90s, early 2000s when it comes to security. Some of like the most basic security flaws that have been known to be bad for quite some time, literally decades, that still exist on these IoT devices, which makes it really fun for researchers like me. Makes it a lot less fun for people that actually deploy them on their networks and aren't paying attention to the potential security holes. Things like hard-coded, weak passwords with remote management access built into them. So like for the technical people out there, open telnet and SSH access to a lot of these devices is just rampant across the industry. And the number of like cameras or DVRs or things that I've gone after and found to have a hard-coded root password that's less than 6 characters far outweighs the number of devices that don't. That's one of the biggest issues that's out there. And as soon as you can crack that password and get into it, you can use that device to pivot and hit the rest of the network. Like people like to joke and say, so I've got a smart fridge, but I don't really care. Why does it matter if the attacker knows what I'm eating? Who cares if they hack that? And they don't care about what you're eating. They don't care about what's on that camera itself. Really, that camera or that smart fridge is basically a mini server, a lot of times a Linux server, which they can infect and then use that as kind of a foothold in your network to go after your more critical systems, maybe your customer management database or your sensitive intellectual property, or maybe just use it to pivot and hit ransomware on all of your systems. That's why these are such a massive security risk out there. And organizations need to make sure that as they're deploying IoT, they're taking precautionary steps to counteract the fact that more often than not, they are hyper vulnerable to a lot of really basic issues. That's things like network segmentation is great. Stick all your IoT on their own individual networks and restrict access into and out of it to what's only specifically required for them to work. Monitor what connections are going to it. If suddenly your smart water cooler is beaconing home to like Russia or China, that's probably a bad sign. Or if your what else do we have in this office? If your meeting little tablet thing on the meeting room starts sending gigabytes worth of data out of the network, maybe someone's trying to use that to exfiltrate data out. So there's a lot you can do to make up for the lack of security in these devices, but it's definitely a proactive approach you have to take as opposed to just plugging it in and hoping it works.
So just out of recent memory, what's one of the more interesting or creative ways that hackers have used IoT vulnerabilities?
A lot of the times, I kind of highlighted on that. We see them use IoT as a pivot point to hit networks, but one of the more interesting ones was actually about 3 years ago now, back in 2016. You probably heard of the Mirai botnet. So it was a botnet that infected primarily IoT DVR systems, so cameras connecting into that to store video, and it went after them really in a really basic way. It just had a list of 68 or so hard-coded usernames and passwords, and if it found an open telnet or open SSH port on the internet, it would try one of those, and if it worked, it would log in and infect that system. Pretty basic stuff, but then that really basic botnet was used to launch record-breaking denial of service attacks against like the French web host OVH, or Brian Krebs, who's a pretty popular security journalist. It went after Dyn, the DNS hosting provider, for a large portion of the internet. Like when they hit Dyn with, I think it was like a terabit per second of internet traffic from this botnet, it took down a lot of major websites like Reddit, Twitter, GitHub, basically all my productivity for a day out the window because of vulnerable DVR systems.
You've touched on some good solutions for people to remember when it comes to things that they can do proactively to secure their networks. But from a WatchGuard perspective, what are some overarching network security thoughts that you have in terms of products and services that people should be looking at?
Yeah, so we always preach in a layered defense is what we call it. And I know a lot of people are probably sick about hearing layered defense, but it's a good motto to live by, because there's no such thing as a silver bullet when it comes to cybersecurity. There's no one product or service that you can install and keep you 100% safe from everything. So you need layers of different types of anti-malware engines on your perimeter and on your endpoints, intrusion prevention services in order to detect exploitation of known vulnerabilities, and then monitoring to back all that up, because eventually something will get through and you need to make sure you can detect and respond to it quickly. A really good highlight of this is one of the things that we track every single quarter, and actually for any time range you want on that threat landscape page I mentioned, is this thing called the zero-day malware ratio, which it boils down to the percentage of malware that we've detected that gets past traditional signature-based antivirus engines. And for example, in the month of September, I just pulled it up, that zero-day malware number was 53%, which meant that if you're relying just on signature-based anti-malware, maybe you just installed McAfee on your computer and called that good and walked away, you're missing 53% of malware that's out there, which is crazy.
Flipping a coin, basically.
Yeah. Imagine missing half of all the malware that's targeting your system. It's not a good thing. And so to combat that, you need other types of anti-malware. Like in our fireboxes, we actually have 3 different layers. We've got the signature-based anti-malware, what we call gateway antivirus, because it still does a good job of quickly detecting known threats. It's really quick, really efficient. Behind that, though, something we call intelligent AV, which is machine learning and artificial intelligence based, where it runs a potential payload through a model and then quickly predicts whether it thinks it's malicious or not. And it does a great job too. But even that's not perfect. So behind that, we've got APT blocker, which is kind of the end all be all, where it's a cloud-based sandbox to send files up to a sandbox and detonate them and just watch their behaviors. Because one thing that all malware has in common is it's malicious. Eventually it's going to do something bad. So when we spot that malicious behavior, we flag it back down and say, this is bad, block it. So that's a good example of why a layered defense is necessary, because if you're not using a layered defense, you're missing half of all malware in that case.
We've talked about the quarterly security reports and your blog, but we also wanted to touch on your podcast, The 443. It's a very creative, fun look at the cybersecurity world. So how'd that idea get started? Where can listeners go to listen, and what episode should they expect?
So we started that a bit over a year ago now, where literally the whole idea came up with, I'm actually pretty big into podcasts. I listen to them in my commute. And I went into our director of communications office and just said, you know what, why don't we have a podcast? It wouldn't be that difficult. Let's get on it. It turns out it is a bit difficult trying to schedule all that every single week and come up with good content. But we ended up narrowing down like what we wanted to target. So our goal is to just take the security news out there, the security threats, the landscape, different topics, and boil it down to something that's really simple for anyone to understand. Like, I think my mom is probably our #1 viewer right now. And we put it out every week, comes out every Monday morning. We've had topics ranging from just news breakdowns of really busy weeks when it seems like there's a million different breaches, to specialized topics. One of my favorite episodes we did, and actually one of our more popular ones, is one where me and Corey Knockran, our CTO at WatchGuard, broke down what the dark web is, how it works, exactly how it works, so that it's a little less mysterious to people that might not spend every day on it. And then we also like to have fun too. Like, we just had, the 30th of September was International Podcast Day. And so we put out something we call the Vulnies, which is our security awards for everything ranging from like the best vulnerability name to the worst breach response. That one we actually videotaped too, so you get to stare at our ugly mugs too. But I mean, we like to have fun. We keep it entertaining. But really we try and take whatever the latest things out there are and make them easy to understand for everyone. And you can find it. It's on secplicity.org/the443. And I'll make sure you guys get a link for that too, to make it a little easier.
I know most of the things that you mentioned you can get to through Secplicity. I know the threat landscape was something that we see on there as well. One other thing that I wanted to point out in some of the other ways that you're spreading this information out there, you had your 2019 security predictions page and video, which kind of highly produced post-apocalyptic world of the aftermath of some cyber incidents, I guess you would say. How'd you come up with that one? And then is there something like that in the works for 2020?
Oh man, that was a blast. If anyone listening hasn't seen it, it's WatchGuard.com/predictions for that one, where really every year we try and come up with these like 5 to 10 different predictions on events we think are going to happen in the coming year. And while some of them might seem like extreme, they're all kind of grounded in trends that we are following and expecting to see really pick off in the upcoming year. And so we started last year's, so 2019's predictions, I guess this year's, in around November of last year. We always start with a brainstorming session where we come up with a bunch of them, pitch out the more outlandish ones, and then kind of hammer home the more believable ones. And we kind of noticed that last year, all of our predictions started following this kind of I don't want to say doom and gloom, but post-apocalyptic theme of just really bad stuff happening, where if you had combined all of them, it probably would be the end of the technological world. Like one of ours was attackers holding the internet hostage, which really followed a trend of attacks and vulnerabilities and security weaknesses in the backbone of the internet with routing protocols like BGP and DNS name resolution. And once we have all the ideas, we try and make it fun so people actually, read or watch the predictions. And so we put out a little video to kind of highlight them, and then a full feature, like hour-long podcast recording where we broke down each prediction and the trend that it followed and why we thought it was actually going to hit. You mentioned highly produced. Our video producer he also produces our podcast. He is fantastic, and we would be absolutely lost without him. But that was one of the more fun days on the job, where I got to wear like a ratty shirt with holes in it as Corey and I are scavenging the wasteland that is Georgetown and Seattle, looking for parts to rebuild the internet. It was fun.
Had you ever acted before, or was that your debut?
You know what? Honestly, I'm a little sad that we didn't get nominated or an Emmy for that. My acting experience goes to like third grade when I was in Treasure Island, I think. That's just about it. Honestly, I can't watch that video we made because I cringe way too hard, but it's still really fun, and I'm looking forward to what we're coming up with for this year. We just had our first round of brainstorming actually the other day. We're kind of narrowing things down, and we're going to start filming something. I don't think we've quite figured out exactly what theme we're going with yet, but we will have something in store for the 2020 predictions that should be fun.
We look forward to that, and I'm sure our listeners do too. So this is our 4th episode here at Ping. You got any advice for fledgling podcasters like us?
I mean, we've been around for about a year. I'm not going to pretend and say we've got everything figured out, but one thing that Corey and I like to do is we just try and keep it fun. Don't be afraid to joke, and keep up the good content, because really that's what keeps people coming back.
All right, Mark, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate having you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you guys for having me on.
To get much of the information Mark mentioned, including blog posts, WatchGuard's threat landscape, the 443 podcast, and more, you can visit the aforementioned secplicity.org. To learn more about WatchGuard products and services, search WatchGuard at our blog, firewalls.com/blog, and shop for WatchGuard at firewalls.com. And as always, no need to write this down. We'll have the links in the description. In this regular segment, we discuss a few top news stories in the network security world and what they may mean to you. In other words, headlines. So we'll start with headline number 1. October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. From the FBI with the theme Own It, Secure It, Protect It. According to the Bureau, internet-enabled crimes and cyber intrusions are becoming increasingly sophisticated. That means everyone needs to be ready and empowered to stop hackers from succeeding. What are some of the tips that we saw from the FBI, Andrew?
So as you said, 2019, this year's motto is Own It, Secure It, Protect It. And the focus is on citizen privacy, consumer devices, and e-commerce security.
Really, it's putting that burden on individuals to think about their security. One of the most common cyber breaches that the FBI points out is still phishing, really. Those phishing scams that users may click on something in an email that they shouldn't, or download something that they shouldn't. So one thing that they really encourage is for users to be especially vigilant regarding what they do open and click.
So National Cybersecurity Awareness Month was created in 2003 by the Department of Homeland Security along with a nonprofit group called the National Cybersecurity Alliance. And each year they have a different theme where they focus on different sort of threats and cybersecurity topics just to spread awareness to both businesses and individual users to be a little more on guard throughout the year.
And so Own It, in this case, means understand understanding your digital profile. That means knowing what devices you use, where you're signed in, etc. Secure it is securing your digital profile, as you may have guessed, by learning about security features on those devices and apps you use, and applying additional layers of security like multi-factor authentication, which is something we just talked about with Mark earlier in the interview, to help protect your information. And that leads into the protect it side, which is maintaining your digital profile, continuously engaging with those first two steps, but also checking your privacy settings on an ongoing basis, as sometimes they change if you're not paying attention, and adjusting them as needed to keep a low profile online.
In our last few episodes, we talked about IoT type security, things like that, where even if there is some responsibility on the vendors or manufacturers, the end users always have that level of personal responsibility to look out for themselves.
Yeah, you can't just trust the manufacturers of devices, the businesses who own websites and operate websites, apps, etc. You really have to be thinking about every holistic exposure that you may have and make sure that you limit it and are doing everything in your power to stay safe online.
And DHS does a lot more than just, a social media campaign about this. If you go to dhs.gov, they actually do have quite a few handy resources. So individuals or organizations can go to dhs.gov and search for Stop, Think, Connect Toolkit. That'll include presentations, flashcards, and just some very easily accessible, ready-made assets for training on cybersecurity.
So if you're interested after you hear this and you want to spread the word, that's a pretty good way to do it. The FBI in particular, related to Cybersecurity Awareness Month, does have some cyber safety tips that they highlighted. Some of these you might recognize from previous episodes. Keep all your systems and software up to date. Examine all emails closely before interacting, like we just mentioned, and don't click on those unsolicited emails asking for personal info, opening unknown attachments, be extra suspicious of any message urging immediate action, and scrutinize any payment or transfer of funds requests and confirm them separately rather than just clicking through and going forward. So, really a lot of these tips. I'll go back to the whole phishing thing. Yeah.
So the 2019 Cybersecurity Awareness Month included a trivia game. It's a Jeopardy-style game that they've made in PowerPoint that you can go download off the website. I got a couple of the trivia questions if you want to try your hand at it.
Oh, I don't know. How much are these worth?
Let's go with 500 points each. So you receive an email from an online shopping site, Kevin, claiming that you were incorrectly charged for your last purchase and are due a refund. The email asks you to click a link where you will submit the necessary information to get your refund. Should you click that link?
Well, it sounds promising if I'm going to get my money back, but I'm going to guess, based on all of those tips that we've just talked about, I'm going to say, what is no, Alex?
No is correct. They suggest to check the message for any typos, check the sender address, stuff like that. And even if it does look legitimate, probably just go to your browser and go to the website directly.
That's a tip that we mentioned already in any payment or transfer of funds requests, or anything from a bank or credit card where they're asking you to update your information. Even if it turns out to be a legitimate email, it doesn't hurt anything for you to just make sure by going directly to the site.
I exclusively pay all my bills in iTunes gift cards. So. All right, one more. True or false? Automatically updating your machine poses a significant security risk, as it could install unwanted programs that disrupt your network.
That sounds scary, but I'm going to say that's false.
That is correct. Yes, you should always update your machines, and having it automated makes that a hassle-free process.
We were just talking to Mark about how there's always new threats out there, and one of the ways to stay ahead of those threats is to make sure that you have everything updated as soon as possible. Patches always come out, and new vulnerabilities vulnerabilities are always discovered, but if you don't patch them, then you're vulnerable.
I believe we have a second, more stringent set of cybersecurity rules as well here.
Yeah, an article in CNBC from cybersecurity expert Tom Kellerman. He had his own list of tips. Some of these are a little bit more hardcore than some that we've seen before, but we thought we'd share those as well. So, they're similar and yet a little bit heavier as well. Make it a point to only share sensitive information if it's a reasonable request, which is basically what we just talked about.
Yes.
Yeah. An example he gave was an online retailer probably shouldn't be asking you for your passport number. When you input your personal details, ensure the website has HTTPS in its web addresses.
Also reasonable.
Yeah, and we've already talked about this before too. Most of web traffic now is encrypted, but there are still some websites that don't have that S for secure, and that lock in your browser that may not show up. You also want to make sure you do homework to ensure the vendors that you're working with haven't had any major security issues of late. We talked about this a few episodes ago. Businesses have cyber breaches, and then you might want to be a little wary of working with them right away afterwards, though sometimes after they have been breached, they ramp it up to a much better level of security.
Consumers are taking that into their purchasing decisions these days.
Mm-hmm. Very specific timeline for a suggestion here, updating all your software every Tuesday night, including all your apps. I know a lot of patches and updates do automatically come out around Monday, Tuesday time frame, but maybe it's just to make sure you pick a night and keep it going.
You got nothing to do on a Tuesday night. So.
It's true. Tuesday night, no football. You're still just kind of getting going in the work week, so probably are kind of chilling out on a Tuesday night. Use security software on all your devices. Make sure you change your home router's password, and this is something we talk about all the time. Default passwords are not the best way to go. Turn on your firewall and use encryption. Again, probably a good idea. Use sentences rather than passwords. This is something that it's really just a habit to get into, and some sites actually make you do this now. It's a newer move in the
3 or 4
world.
word long pass-phrases.
Mm-hmm. And as Mark was mentioning earlier, you don't want to use the same one over and over and over again either. Also, this is one of the more challenging tips that he has. Never use public Wi-Fi or Bluetooth unless you use a VPN. Sounds like a good security measure, but maybe not always practical.
Sometimes you just have to hop on the Wi-Fi at McDonald's.
But be careful when you do, and make sure that you're logging onto the correct network. Sometimes there are people out there who spoof a network. It's changed something slightly. It looks like you're signing into the McDonald's Wi-Fi, but maybe it's McDonald's without an apostrophe or something, and you could be in a dangerous situation. And finally, never use your debit card online. Now, I think this makes sense. You don't want your bank your accounts actually directly exposed online. When you have a credit card, you have a little bit more protection there from the card company. But some people try not to use credit cards, so this one might be a little more challenging.
Yeah, you might have to, in this case, set up a PayPal. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely have other options, the PayPals of the world, the Apple Pays, Google Pays, Venmo.
Yeah. Zelle.
Yep. But anyway, going back one final time, if you wanted to check out more of this Cybersecurity Awareness Month materials, hashtag for October is BeCyberSmart. And another website you can find, staysafeonline.org/NCSAM. On to headline number 2. We talk about ransomware a lot. We talked about it earlier with Mark as well. We talked more about the idea of places getting victimized, then having to decide whether to pay the ransom or spend money to recover their data in a different way. But you don't always think about the other implications of a ransomware attack. In this particular story, it's a story mentioning that U.S. hospitals actually had to turn away patients as they were exposed to ransomware. So the Druid City Health Group in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, had a few hospitals that were victimized by a ransomware attack, making big chunks of their patient data inaccessible, and those hospitals basically closed temporarily following that attack, diverting new admissions and even ambulance traffic to other facilities.
Yeah, so the DCH Regional Medical Center operates all three of the affected hospitals, Tuscaloosa, Fayette, and Northport Medical Center. They serve western Alabama, a pretty large portion of that region, so this is a pretty major inconvenience and possibly even life-threatening postponement of services here. They're also the second largest employer in Tuscaloosa County, so this is affecting quite a lot of people.
Yeah, the hospitals were still performing some of their previously scheduled surgeries and taking some critical patients that they were best suited to address. But yeah, basically the hospital closes its doors for a period of time to figure out what to do. In the medical world, that's certainly a pretty major impact to the people of a region.
So the incident was first reported on October 1st, and as of yet, no actual ransom has been asked for and no amount given. So they're kind of just sitting on their hands for the moment.
And this story was in the BBC website. They also mention another similar issue affecting a 7-hospital chain in Victoria, Australia. These hospitals didn't necessarily fully shut down, but they had to disconnect multiple computer systems. So again, records, appointments, management services affected, and some of those appointments may need to be rescheduled because they don't have patient histories, charts, and other information, and they're looking to maybe switch over to manual records for the time being.
Yeah, and I'm sure they can work off of manual records. They've done it in the past, obviously, but it definitely slows things down some. It makes things less efficient for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing in this story, they talked to a cybersecurity expert who notes that the bad guys out there are getting better and better at infiltrating an entire network like this after gaining access through an individual device. So just because a computer at one of these hospitals may be a victim of the attack doesn't mean that the rest of the chain isn't going to be affected too. And we're seeing that live right here with both of these hospital chains. Everybody gets affected when one does.
Correct, yeah. And hospitals and healthcare in general is becoming a larger target for ransomware. There's a lot of different points of entry on the network. You usually have a very large staff with varying degrees of cybersecurity know-how and training. So you got nurses, doctors, orderlies, administrators, maintenance, billing specialists, the whole range of thousands of employees at one facility that you have to watch over.
And then you have the patients and their families visiting who are probably popping on your Wi-Fi networks and things of that nature too. So certainly a lot of exposure area there. The reminder from this story, again from their cybersecurity expert, and something basically that we've talked about in other ransomware stories and with Mark earlier, organizations should always review their security procedures and ensure that backups are in place, and also that key that Mark mentioned, that such backups had been recently tested so that you can quickly restore back to right where you were.
Correct, yes. A lot of hospitals don't focus too heavily on cybersecurity past basic HIPAA compliance, but I know there is some issues with keeping long-term medical records for patients, but there's definitely backups available and possible even in the healthcare industry.
On to headline number 3. What is formjacking? Have you heard of formjacking? It's a new cybersecurity scam that's on the rise. Basically, formjacking involves a hacker placing malicious code onto a normally reputable website that then steals the personal info that you enter into a form.
Yeah, this is my first time hearing about this myself. So.
There's always a new term out there that we may not have heard before. But this one really does place that onus, word that I think I used a bunch in our last episode. The onus is on the website owner, certainly, to stay secure with strong security measures in place, because there's really not a lot that the user can do to note that a form may actually have that sort of skimmer in there to take their data.
Yeah, the article mentions that companies and organizations can do their part to make sure this is secured with, basic ongoing security. But as far as the consumer is concerned, there's not a whole lot they can do to stop this.
Basically, as a consumer, you have to be more generally vigilant to be able to catch this more likely after it happens in the first place.
So think of formjacking similar to like a credit card scammer you hear about on an ATM or a gas pump, where you swipe. Everything seems to have worked and been approved as normal with no indication that anything's gone wrong. And then you later learn through your credit card statement or maybe your credit reporting company that something has been fraudulently charged to you.
Yeah, so really one of the key tips here is to constantly check your credit card statements and see if there's something that's not quite right on there, and bring that to your credit card company's attention. And depending on what the form has, if it's a form that asks you for your social security number, that's where the credit report may come in, because somebody will have probably tried to use that social security number to open up other accounts in your behalf.
Yeah, and formjacking targets more than just, basic payment forms. It can target things such as job applications, government forms, or really even any secure site where you're asked to input any information.
Which is a lot of sites.
Yes. This is relatively new, but exactly how popular is it?
We'll definitely have to see how big of an issue it becomes, but you're the immediate victim here, so it's something that you have to constantly keep an eye on. There are some other suggestions in here. Your credit card company can actually give you a special number for online transactions only, so if you do find out that your account has been compromised, you won't have to chop up your physical card and throw it away and start fresh with a new number. You can just get rid of that digital thumbprint and move on to another one of those.
And they also suggest setting up a separate card or account on the side to use specifically for online transactions, different from your primary account used for bills and normal everyday expenses. That
way you would more easily be able to sift through and notice if there's something suspicious going on. They also mention mobile payment apps, as we talked about earlier, like Apple Pay, Google Pay, etc. Some of these apps are maybe a little bit more secure because there's an extra level of encryption going on and you're not actually entering your credit card number into a site. You're paying through that extra layer.
Yeah, basically any step you can take to add one more layer of protection is always well advised.
For the companies that could be affected by this, one of the ways that these bad elements can get in are potentially through some third-party add-ons and plugins to your website. So that's something you really need to monitor closely on your website. Make sure that those don't have extra vulnerabilities. Secure that whole of your website from top to bottom, and it's less likely that you'll be victimized.
Yeah, and this type of attack can potentially target just about any website out there, secure or insecure. So it's really just on the end user to stay vigilant, and basically everybody that runs a website to also do their ongoing due diligence.
And now it's time for our Engineers Minute. At Firewalls.com, we're fortunate to have a team of certified network engineers who offer a variety of services for top security brands like firewall configurations, endpoint deployment, and expert support, to name a few.
In our Engineers Minute, one of our experts takes a moment each episode to provide a tip or answer to a question. And that's where you come in. Leave a question in the comments or email us at podcast@firewalls.com, and you just may get your question answered in a future episode.
On this edition, our engineer Michael checks in to talk about how maximizing your firewall will maximize your protection against the latest threats.
One thing we are adamant about at Firewalls.com is that a firewall is not a set-it-and-forget-it appliance. This is because businesses and their networks are constantly evolving, which means so are their functionality and security needs. When you combine that with a network security threat landscape that is also constantly changing, you need to make sure you're protected from today's most sophisticated threats. This is best achieved by starting with a firewall configuration that is built with business-specific objectives in mind. Behind every great network security appliance is a team of security and malware analysts combing through security analytics and making tweaks on the back end that are in some cases automatically downloaded to the security appliance in the form of pattern updates. In other cases, the more major updates to things such as scanning engines and new security features are made available via firmware updates, which require human interaction. As with any update, these are vital to ensure the configuration initially implemented is able to protect against the latest threats and CVEs. This ensures that the layers of security provided by web content filtering, gateway antivirus, application control, and intrusion prevention engines are able to defend against today's latest threats. We're seeing a shift in the mindset of decision makers within organizations, both large and small, that understand what's at stake, and they understand the typical role of the network administrator is to manage everything on the network, including servers, printers, Wi-Fi, desktop support, and more. But the challenge our net admins are facing is that it's difficult for them to have the time it takes to properly configure and maintain the network perimeter. So, we tend to see a lot of customers turn to Firewalls.com for our expertise in configuring and managing these security appliances. Our professional services team monitor businesses' firewalls to make sure the devices are available, running the latest OS and patterns, operating in a healthy state, and jumping into action on possible security threats in areas such as intrusion attempts, brute force attacks, and potential malware being downloaded, to name a few. When you combine this approach with custom reporting data, it has proven to be an invaluable tool that allows organizations to get out ahead of these rapidly evolving threats and keep their network operating efficiently and clean.
To learn more about what our network engineers can do for your business, give us a call at 866-403-5305 or go to firewalls.com/services.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get the latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us wherever you listen to the podcast. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, but in the meantime, we remind you to get secure,
secure,
stay secure.